I guess we'll just start. Nick, can you let us know, I guess, what discipline you're in and then what you've been up to since leaving AIE?
Yeah, so as Craig said, I'm Nicholas Zaharias, currently working over at Quebec City at Larian Studios. So what was the question again? What am I doing?
Yeah, what have you been doing? So you graduated, then you moved to...
2014, gameplay programmer. I've had like a bit of a weird, I don't know, it's not that weird. I guess it's pretty typical for most developers about where you've worked, but had a couple of jump-in jobs before I finally landed on Larian Studios, where it looks like I'm going to be there for like, the foreseeable future until they get rid of me, maybe. It's a potential sort of thing, but yeah. I mean, I graduated, what, 2014?
2014, and then where did you get work straight after?
Straight after that was, I actually did an internship before I got a full-time gig or anything like that, and that was just over at Dreamgate Studios, who unfortunately have shut down in the past year. Yeah, I would say about, I think it was the past year. Working with a couple guys and girls that graduated from here. We worked there for on and off, I think it was like 2.5 days a week we did internship, and then they were kind enough for the other 2.5 days a week to actually pay us so that we could do a content update for it, which never actually got shipped, which was a little bit disappointing, but it was, a lot of fun at the time. But then after that, I moved on to Halfbrick Studios. And I worked on Jetpack Joyride for the next 2 years, essentially just doing content updates, which is great for experience, but I don't think I'd ever want to go back to again, because it's basically sometimes when you're working in mobile games, you're kind of just pushing ads on people if you're not making a game from start to finish or something like that. Yeah.
And so then from Jetpack, did you go straight to working in Canada, or did you...
Yeah, what happened?
Or did you do some contract work while you were here in Game Plus?
Yeah. I don't think, I did a little bit of contract work, but essentially what happened was at Halfbrick, and I think it was just kind of like a culmination of things. Like I'd always wanted to work overseas. It was kind of one thing, and getting a working holiday visa, you can only do that up until you're 30, including 30. And so it's kind of like work was offering redundancies at the time, because they were kind of just like trying to get rid of staff that weren't excited for the company from the ground up and that sort of thing. But I mean, whilst you might be very excited, there's also the temptation to take a 10 grand payout and then use that money to find yourself another job overseas or something like that. So I think at the time it was, the payout, plus the fact that my lease was expiring, plus the fact that I only have a couple years left if I wanted to do a working holiday visa. They kind of all pushed me to search for jobs overseas. Canada I originally chose just for the fact that A, it's super easy to get a working holiday visa, but B, it's also an English-speaking country, that you can get work at. And out of all that, I managed to fall into the French province, which definitely makes life a little bit harder, but don't regret it at all.
Cool.
Stressful. Stressful is definitely a thing when you're trying to talk to someone and you only know 10 sentences in their language. So I think when I first went over, all I knew was oui, non, bonjour, merci, and I think I learned one extra, which was before I got there, which was vous tu danser, which is would you like to have a dance, because that's kind of what I do in my social time. So that was enough, I guess, to make me survive. I'm still here, I guess. Cool. I haven't moved back yet, so I guess it's going well.
Nice. So your role at Larian, you're a gameplay programmer.
Gameplay programmer at Larian Studios.
What's that entail? What area of the game is gameplay, if that sounds
well,
silly?
the one I can talk about the most is Divinity Original Sin 2 and what I did for that.
Ooh.
So when I first came over, they just had me doing some very basic stuff to learn essentially the engine, because they work with their own custom C++ engine, not Unity or UE4 or even Gamebryo, I think, that Bethesda use still. Yeah, anyways, it's not like an engine you can kind of learn before you get there. Engines tend to share a lot of things specific, but there's always going to be those little quirks, lots and lots of little quirks that come down to when you're using a custom engine. This is both for programmers and for art or designers, that sort of thing. You're always going to have these crappy tools that you're going to have to just learn to live with until someone gets around to updating it, which usually never happens because that's the lowest priority sort of situation. Yeah, so I got hired on as gameplay programmer. I was hired onto a junior position at the time. And I think the first thing I did was probably put like vampirism into the game or something like that. It was like all the systems were already set up and they were just looking to add some like extra cool spells into the game. So I think like some of the first ones I did was like vampiric spells, so it could like sap your health or your armor. I think I did a cleaving tax for weapons, which technically you can put on bows, but it was never actually officially supported. And then you catch a designer that put a cleave attack on a bow, and then you're like, I don't know what you were expecting to happen there, and then the code kind of goes a little bit funky. And apart from that, then I only got to put a couple features in before we went into overtime, doing the crunch period, which is essentially just fix all the bugs, as many as you possibly can, until it releases. Then it released, and then I spent a couple more, I think I spent like between 5 and 8 patches worth of doing just bug fixes on stuff that just got sent my way. And then after that, I got moved on to doing a bunch of prototyping for the next project.
Which you can tell us now
is named Gustav, and that's all you get.
Cool. No, thanks for letting us know even Gustav's.
No. If you should actually look on Twitter, Sven, I always forget his last name, Sven Vicky. He actually has like a bunch of people were bugging him about what's the next project, and so literally it's a picture of his dog, which is named Gustav, and so that's the next project.
Cool. I'm going to start writing what I think that is.
Yeah, you can just bug Sven for information.
Can you tell us a little bit about what it's like working with a custom engine like that? Most of us here have probably worked with a bit of Unity, Unreal, maybe.
Yeah, so when you're here, you're super spoiled if you ever work with Unity or UE4. Programmers-wise, do we have like any programmers around? Cool. And how many of you have worked with the AIE framework, which you would have started? I assume you would still start with. So that thing was like super rudimentary. In fact, you had no debugging, sorry, not no debugging, you had no like usability tools or anything like that. You didn't like get to do drag drops and stuff like that. So R1 does have drag and drop usability, but you kind of like think about the gap between the AIE framework and maybe say working with Unity is like, oh my God, Unity's got all these beautiful little tools that you get to do, and it's just got all these nice debugging features. When you kind of move to different companies, also depends on the size of the company, because Ubisoft obviously is going to have a much nicer in-house engine than for us, for example, because our studio started with 5 people, scaled up to 30, then scaled up to 80, and then you look at Ubisoft and they've got, what, 12,000 employees around the world, so they're going to have a much better situation than we are. But yeah, working with the tools, you find there are things which work really well and just work straight out of the box, and then half the time you're just going to be jumping in between, like just jumping through hoops just to get something working. I guess that's probably a little bit more applicable to the artists and designers, because I don't actually work in the tool itself that much, apart from maybe like, hey, we need a new feature, then I might jump into the tool to make sure that the feature integration works properly, or I might jump into the tool to make sure the feature that I've finished working isn't like throwing bugs or any asserts or stuff like that. But yeah, you'll definitely find that working on UE4 and Unity, you're going to be a lot more spoiled for the tools that you get right out of the box. But the advantage of working on the custom tool is that it does exactly what the game is meant to be working on. Whereas Unity and UE4, it's kind of like, it's meant to fit a lot of different things, but it never really does each of those things really, really well. Except maybe the exception would be UE4, because that was always built from being a first-person shooter from the ground up. I guess, like, yeah, I mean, Unreal Tournament, right? So,
is there anything people could be doing to maybe get more flexible so that if they do go work at a studio that has those custom things, or is it like, write your own engine, figure it out?
I mean, from a programming perspective, you should always write your own engine, because then you can actually understand little bits of what's going on behind the scenes. For the artists, I imagine you guys are probably still using Maya from the top of my head.
Yeah.
How many of you had some issues with Maya exports and stuff like that, especially if you're trying to import it into another engine? Yeah, just a couple. You're going to have that for the rest of your career, so you're going to start getting used to it. It becomes even worse when it becomes a third-party engine. So the more you get used to like the little things that you kind of have to do, the better. Having said that, I'm not saying like these are things that will never ever get fixed or ignored. A big problem that we have at the studio is the artists have a lot of these little pains and annoyances. And sometimes it's just kind of like, you just need to live with it. But sometimes it's like, these pains and annoyances are costing me like 5 hours a week which for us is very much unacceptable and is something that we would spend the time to fix. So I'd say for the artist side of things, and this kind of applies for the designers as well, understanding how long the little pains are costing you in time, being able to say to someone, hey, this feature really pisses me off, they'd be like, okay, we're probably going to ignore that. But if you say, hey, this feature is costing me 10 hours, 5 hours a week of development time just to get it into the engine, suddenly that's become a lot more higher priority for the company, because if it's not going to be just you, it'll be all the other artists that are probably going to have a similar issue, and they're probably just not talking about it because there tends to be a bit of a weird discrepancy between art, design, and programmers understanding about what is an actual high importance thing. Because I do feel like sometimes artists or designers are asking for features that the programmers are saying, oh, we don't have enough time, and a lot of people assume that means, okay, I can't ask for anything now, and they kind of have to live with the shit.
What's that balance been like across the different studios that you've been at? So like, don't have to get into specifics at different studios, but say for Half Brick, is it very much you're a small core team, and then at Larian, is it more?
So Half Brick was very much, we had small teams of 10 of like the actual core developers. So we had 3 programmers, 2 artists, we had someone doing analytics, we had a producer, the product manager, and I think we had 2 QA testers, whatever number that comes up to. So we had a very core team, but then we had kind of like the support teams, which is the engine. We had people that did a lot of the ad mediation for the game. So like we would kind of put some code into the game, which then links to all this other code that they'd kind of put together so that we could serve ads to the users. And so when it comes, you'll find that once you've got a core team, things can go pretty fast and things can go pretty well. But as soon as you start kind of depending on the outside teams, that's when you really need to have good communication skills, and being even able to just, sometimes it comes down to being able to write a very detailed problem with test examples or screenshots of videos and those sorts of things. And you send that off to the other team and let them know this is what the problem is, and more specifically, this is the result that it's having in, is generally one of the best things that you can possibly do, because there are plenty of situations where it's just like, shit's broke, and you just send them that message, and then they're like, cool, I don't care because you didn't give me any information about it. And you kind of just have this back and forth stalemate where nothing really happens, and then eventually your product manager comes down and just like, none of this is working, why is that? And then you kind of try and shift the blame to them, and they shift the blame back to you, and it's never ending, really. That's kind of like, Half Brick, that was a small studio. Larian is very much a very traditional waterfall approach, but that might be changing, because Larian at the moment is in this weird middle phase where we used to be a small studio of like 30 people, and it's very, very easy to keep things managed and handled. It's very easy to communicate within your team. But once you start going up to 100 plus people, and especially when those people are spread around the world, communication.
Where are the studios located for?
Yeah, so we've got Quebec City is where I'm based. The original studio is in Ghent in Belgium. Then we've also got a studio in Russia, St. Petersburg, and we've also got a studio in, I want to say, oh, I can't remember where it is in actually. No, Dublin. It's in Dublin in Ireland. So essentially it's kind of like the breakdown is we got quite a few artists in Quebec, we've got the writers in Dublin, we've got kind of a mixed bag in Ghent, because since it's kind of like the home of the company, and then we've got a lot of programmers over in St. Petersburg.
So essentially, it sounds, my geography's bad, but pretty much the game's being worked on 24 hours a day as the...
Very close to. Like when we're in crunch time, we do have a full 24-hour handover. Like me and one of the other programmers will probably be there until maybe 12 midnight, 1 a.m. sometimes, like if there's a build that really needs to get put out. And as we're doing the build and the build is finishing and we're publishing it to the rest of the company, we'll probably have someone from St. Petersburg is logged on, and we kind of do a handover with them.
The students have probably heard a whole bunch of crunch lately in the media and stuff like that. Can you talk about what that process is like, or is it different for different studios?
Always different for every single studio. Half Brick, I don't think I ever remember doing any crunch, maybe 8 hours.
And crunch being overtime?
Crunch being overtime. Basically, crunch is everyone needs to crunch down, get the work done, because we've got an important deadline that's coming up, essentially. So it's basically, the company's asking you to do overtime. If you're a full-time employee, you can technically say no. There is nothing stopping you from doing that. But I think, I don't know, I couldn't tell you exactly how the laws work, but there are, like if you're not putting it into the company, they can kind of turn around and just be like, well, maybe you're not a good fit here and that sort of thing. But I was very lucky at Halfbrick. I never really had to do any overtime crunch. Nothing excessive or anything like that. When I was at Larian Studios, we had to put in, I think I did about 3 to 4 months of crunch towards the end of the project, and that was just bug fixing.
And what do those hours look like? Is it?
It's at Larian, they're very nice in that every hour over you do, you'll get an hour back on your holidays. So it's not like they're just asking you to do it for free or anything like that. And they usually, if you don't want to take it on holidays, they'll just pay it out to you, which is pretty cool. But usually the hours, you tend to set it yourself a little bit of what you can handle. I know some people who just won't crunch at Larian, and that's completely acceptable because they've got families they need to look after. I think on averaging, normally my work day is from 9 a.m. in the morning, an hour break, and finishing at 6 p.m. And then if I was crunching, usually the minimum I'd do would be 8 p.m., but between 8 and 10 p.m. is usually what I'd do. And you just come in the next day and repeat it 5 days a week for a couple months. So it does take the toll, and especially over in the northern hemisphere, if you're doing it, it's going to really take a toll on your social life and also on your mental health. Because when it's winter over there, it's super dark. So you go in the morning and it's dark, and you leave at night and it's dark, and you basically don't see sun for quite a few months. So it really hits you hard, and that sort of thing. But yeah, in the industry right now, there's a big pushback against crunch, especially after, I think what we had, Red Dead Redemption 2, I think some came out. Telltale recently had a bunch of issues going in there, and they closed down as well. I think there were some other studios that there was big pushbacks about crunch. So it might be a situation where it's actually finally starting to get moved around, but you'll definitely find the smaller the studio, the more crunch kind of needs to be done. Yeah. Usually because they've got the tighter budget and tighter deadlines essentially to meet.
Do you have any activities outside of working on the game that kind of just helps relax you, maybe just gets your head away from the project for a bit?
It's an interesting one. Because kind of once you've been, especially if you're doing crunch at the time, the last thing you want to do is actually go out and see other people. You kind of just want to go home and relax. But it's actually completely the opposite, or at least for me it is. Because if I've been doing crunch and I skip any social activities or anything like that, I become into a worse mental state. I'll probably start cooking for myself, so then I start eating worse. Then my mental state drops even worse, as well as my physical health, and those sorts of things. So personally, I love to do dancing. I recently became pretty addicted to it. And so normally I'd be doing that like 3-4 times a week. And then when crunch hits, then you start doing it less and less because you just don't have the energy or you want to get more sleep. But it's definitely important to keep it up as much as you possibly can. Keep up the physical exercise because it'll stop you from like completely destroying yourself, and shutting yourself off from your social networks is going to be even harder, especially when you've got those really long days going on. But that's only assuming that you're doing crunch. But even like, especially northern hemisphere, when it's during the winter times, that's when you need your social networks the most. It's really, you've got to get out of your house and you've got to make sure you're eating well for that sort of situation.
A lot of the projects you've worked on, like Divinity, Jetpack, they've been games that have been worked on for a long time before you stepped in.
Yeah, essentially. So Jetpack Joyride, I think, had been out for 5+ years before I even touched it. Divinity Original Sin, I think, had been in development for at least 2 to 3 years. And that sort of thing. Coming
into a code base that's been there for so many years?
It's not so bad sometimes because people have zero expectations of you, because it's not like, I mean, the game's already mostly done, or if not already out, right? So they're just looking for extra features, and something that is pretty cool when it comes to a game that isn't going to be supported later on is you don't have to worry as much about how clean you keep things. That's always an interesting issue when it comes to programming is, do I hack it in or do I do it the correct way that's, kind of a little bit more future-proof and easy to work with down the line and that sort of thing.
What's the correct answer?
I mean, when it came to Jetpack Joyride, because we knew it was going to be consistently maintained, the people that originally did it kind of did a lot of stuff what we would consider a very hacky way. I mean, if you look back at the time and you look back at what they were doing back in the day, it makes a lot of sense because they were trying to get things out in a deadline to meet ends meet, essentially, because they only had X number of funding. But then once the game is actually supporting itself, so we came along and we took it up the game, and then we're just looking at all these old systems that are just like barely held together by sticks and string, and it's just like, all right, can we carefully pull some of this apart, rewrap it so it actually is dependable, and go from that point. And that's what we did a lot for Jetpack Joyride, is taking a lot of the old systems, reworking them so they're a little bit more stable, and then adding onto it. Because basically the twigs and the string, we just couldn't add onto it without things going too wrong. So that's what we spent a lot of time on Jetpack. When it comes to Divinity, some things we knew were going to be thrown away, and so that's kind of cool because you can just hack it in and you don't have to worry. On the other side, because we knew that the engine itself and a lot of the gameplay features that we took from Divinity are most likely going to move on to the next game, because I wouldn't say it's rare that you completely throw away an engine and when you start on a new game, but especially when I think the entire company's kind of wrapped up in this engine. I mean, if you look at Bethesda as a really good example here, they still work with the Gamebryo engine, and they get a lot of criticism for that. But what a lot of people probably don't realize is that engine has been reworked so many different times over the coming years that it probably barely resembles what Gamebryo was in the first place. But on the downside of that, I guarantee there are still some really weird quirks of Gamebryo that are still present in that game engine to this day, and most likely it's the artists and the designers that eat the problems on that sort of thing, or coders their hands are tied. They're like, we have to do it this way because that's kind of how just the engine works in that sort of thing.
What was it? So as soon as because it was pretty quickly that you got a job at Half Brick after studying, I want to say like less than 6 months, 6 months-ish?
Well, that's the thing. What was it? So I got an internship at Dreamgate, and just for the shits and giggles, I saw there was a position for an internship over at Half Brick. I wasn't expecting to hear back from them at all, and they actually sent me a message after I'd already accepted my internship over at Dreamgate. They say, yeah, if you want, you can come do an internship at Half Brick Studios. I was like, oh, I'm sorry, I've already taken one. They're like, okay, well, just shoot us a message once you finish. And so I shot them a message after I finished. I was expecting to do another internship, but they flew me. We did, I think it was a couple interviews over the phone or online, and then they flew me up for a face-to-face interview, and I did a proper programming test with them. And yeah, then they put me in for a junior position.
What was that? Not without going necessarily to specifics, but what was the programming test like for Half Brick and I guess Larian, if you can?
So I've actually done quite a few programming tests. I like to try and reach around and see what's out there. I've done programming tests for 2K, for Ubisoft, I think I did one for what was the company? They worked on a game called Juggernaut that recently released, and they're working on a new one. Anyway, I did a programming test for those guys as well. I've done a couple. The Half Brick one was pretty cool because it was just a bunch of C++ tests, C++ questions for the very basic ones. So basically, essentially, they were just saying how good is his basic C++ knowledge, like the basic knowledge that we'd expect any programmer to have. And they always chuck in some really difficult ones. I even did the same when I went over to Dreamgate as well, actually. There's kind of like questions everyone should get, questions that they expect you to get, and if you're not getting that, they probably won't really consider you after that. And then they've got questions to see how well do they really know their knowledge, or how in-depth into these questions did they go. That was a little bit like at Half Brick as well, but actually when doing a proper, I'd say kind of like the gameplay test, which is what I did with Half Brick Studios, and I even did one with Larian Studios as well, actually. The Half Brick one is I got up there, they gave me a completely custom engine with some code already written and said, all right, we want you to put this feature in. And I had a designer who was sitting over my shoulder, and he's just like, all right, cool, I want the character to be able to do this. And so I'd chat with him, kind of see what he really wanted from it. I'd program it in, get some feedback from him, and maybe suggest something else, or, and those sorts of things. And we kind of just did like a better back and forth iteration. And then the one I did for Larian Studios was they just said, make Breakout, essentially, is what they told me. They said I didn't have to worry about making the engine itself. Like I could use a third-party graphics library for the programmers out there. I think I couldn't even remember what I used. It was just like a very bare bones sort of thing. And I just made Breakout, and they were just looking to see some of the choices I made. Was it a fun game? Did it actually, could you actually play the game? Like simple things like, did it have a pause menu maybe? Did it have a menu at all?
Could you... these things that they asked you to put in there? Or
they didn't ask me at all. They wanted to see me put in this stuff. They wanted to see how much extra effort would I put into this to try and get it working, to try and make it a fun game, essentially. So I think one of the things that they gave me some feedback for was that when I was designing Breakout, is I made it so that there were just a bunch of text files that you could change. And so if you change this text file, you could change how the level was made. If you changed this text file, you could say how many balls were in the game, how many paddles were in the game, and these sorts of things. And they really enjoyed that sort of thing. So whilst I didn't dig deep into juiciness of the game, like making it super, super fun, I did make it very customizable so people could kind of come along and change it, and they gave me some feedback that they really liked that.
And do you think they like that because it shows that you're thinking about other people in the team when you're...
I'm thinking about other people in the team, but I'm also thinking about longevity of the game itself. I'm not just thinking, here's something I hacked together because it's for a test. I'm actually thinking, no, this is actually some decent programming practices to put together to show off to people, essentially. I mean, recently I've been helping some of the animators. We've been looking for some technical artists at the studio, and I've been having the lead technical artist has been shoving some stuff my way because he knows I have a lot of experience with UE4 blueprints, for example, and that's one of the things that they were just sending their way to see what they could do with UE4 blueprints, because when it comes to that, that's a very technical art side of thing, and it's kind of like that expectation of what can this person do, and it's very quickly easy to see that someone that's just kind of hacked something together just to get it to work, and someone that's actually taken the time to make it something that can be extended and worked upon continually. Because I don't know how many people know UE4 blueprints, but essentially it's just like I'm in my running state and I want to go to my stopping state, and so you'd have a line that goes from one to the other. And then a real horrible one that I've seen is just like it's just spaghetti all over your screen, and you're like, I can't follow what goes to what. It's very impossible. And then we had another one, for example, and it's just like, here's the running, transitioned over here. It had like a state that would split it off into the three. Things were very self-contained. It was very easy to follow. And it's just a very small visual thing like that. And you can instantly say, okay, this person actually understands their stuff a little bit better on this front. There's still the expectation that you also know your other stuff as well for the job that you're applying for.
Thanks for attacking my visual scripting style.
That's okay.
That hurt. I guess the other big thing that I'm super keen to know is what skills does current Nick wish that second year Nick was focusing on? Was there anything that you're like, oh, if I had listened to Tony, that would have helped me a whole bunch more?
I always wish I'd listened to Tony. Geez, what was it? First year, what were we doing? I think we were doing game engines. We're doing, I think, a little bit of AI and that sort of stuff. I do remember I took the initiative with one of the other programmers in first year, and we were given the task of, I think we were starting our first game engine, and we kind of the instructions were kind of to do it this more of a legacy way, but we had heard about a new way and we wanted to try it, so we just gave it a go, and it worked really, really well. And I felt that really helped us, I wouldn't say in the long run of my career or anything like that, but it's just kind of, sometimes it's just taking small risks like that that has really paid off for me. That's the cool thing about the uni is it gives you a little bit of experience into a lot of little different things, and it's kind of from that point that you really start branching out into what you're interested in. So for example, just that small thing I did in my first year made me realize how much I enjoy working with engines in a part-time basis. I like understanding kind of what's going on behind the scenes, but more specifically, I really like writing shaders, which is kind of sometimes a lot of the visual effects that you'll see in games is done through some of these sorts of things. Half the time, they kind of we'll have artists work on them, but there are also plenty of things that, for example, like a water shader is sometimes not something that we actually put to an artist, and it's actually more something that might be done by a graphics programmer, because it comes down to a lot of mathematics rather than the visual side of things. Obviously, we'd have artists that are checking it off and giving feedback and that sort of thing, but sometimes there are things that are just a little bit too complex to initially hand off to an artist, and sometimes you're going to have that, both the programmer who's working on the technical side of thing and the artist giving the visual feedback for that sort of thing. I'm thinking about things I'd really wish I'd done more of. Game jams are always a good one. more specifically, rather than, I guess, I always felt like game jams, we always kind of rushed into things, you know, just like, oh, we have to come up with this perfect idea, and we have to come up with this perfect execution. Whereas I think sometimes a little bit beforehand is kind of just finding who you work well together with, how you communicate, and just being able to execute on a single thing is just enough when it comes for a game jam and those sorts of things. And also I wish I'd spent more time doing just very small personal projects and finishing them to completion. I mean, these days when I get a chance, when I've got some downtime, I love to dig into shaders is something I was talking to before. Like I was doing a breakdown of the Diablo 3 resource orb recently, and that's been a lot of fun trying to recreate that. But when you're working full time, you do not have the time to do this unless it's, you know, of course, your own personal time. Whereas when I was at university, it's kind of, there was definitely a lot more of a lot more time to experiment and play around with these sorts of things.
How do you keep your skills relevant as you do that? So if
keeping skills relevant is a really hard thing to do.
Yeah.
For the coders, sometimes it just comes down to you have to be reading up on the latest documentation. Like I think there's a current push in the industry pushing towards entity component system patterns, which for the programmers out there, a traditional approach that you might have learned would have been the object orientated, which is a cat is an animal, inherits from the animal in that sort of situation. And then we've got the entity pattern, which is everything is an entity, which is kind of what the object orientated pattern falls into as well. And you've got entity components, which is an entity is made up of a bunch of different things. So rather than a dog is an animal, no, a dog is made up of a barking component, a movement component, a steering component. You know, you've got all these different little things that make it up together. And now we've kind of been moving towards this next one, which is entity component system. And you still have these components that are made up, but instead of the entity updating the components, we now have these entire systems which only update a single type of component. But definitely being aware of what is the new stuff that's kind of like a lot of what the big studios are working on really, really helps. Being up to date with some of the latest techniques. You don't have to be perfect at the techniques. Sometimes it's just being aware of the techniques, so then you can suggest it at your workplace. So you're like, hey, I'd really like to try this for this new feature that's coming up, and that sort of situation.
So when you're looking at doing personal projects on the side, is it always like a, hey, this is a thing I might be able to implement at work sometime, or sometimes this could potentially be a pathway my career goes in the future?
Sometimes it is, yeah. This I could do at work, but I think a lot of the time I just chase the things that I enjoy, and that's kind of what makes me as a programmer at the studio. Is kind of what makes me suitable. Because in my personal time, I'd worked in a lot with Unreal 4, just in a personal manner, and I'd worked a bit with the UE4 blueprints, which is essentially it's a mix of coding and animation. It's kind of like that link between the two. And because of that, because I actually already had some experience with it, we didn't have exactly this, but we did do a little bit of prototyping in UE4, and then we had a system which, not the same, but similar in some aspects. I was then one of the few people that actually knew already how to work in such a system, and I could make recommendations, I could make suggestions, and I could work with the artists to help train them up so that they could use it more efficiently and correctly.
I'm going to keep asking questions. If you're out there and you've started thinking and have been thinking of some questions, definitely hold on to them, because we'll probably in the next 5 or so start sharing the microphone so that other people can actually ask stuff.
You'd never do that.
You don't have to jump onto the mic as well. You can just throw the question up. One thing I'm super keen for is what is it like working in Quebec City or in Canada in general? Is it a close-knit community, or is it like, you know, there's the big end of town, here's the
I feel actually horrible. I haven't been to a single game dev meetup, but I think that is more because of the language barrier than anything else. I actually have been meaning, because it's taken me about 1.5 years before I can actually feel like I can have a proper conversation with someone in French. And I feel like now that I'm at that stage, I could probably go along to the game dev meetups. And having said that though, I guarantee probably all the game dev meetups are in English anyway, or at least everyone there would probably be able to speak English. Something that I've come across is very common is when it comes to gamers, a lot of gamers know English just because there are so many games out there that just aren't translated, especially older games were not translated back in the day into these different languages. So you had a lot of foreign countries which really enjoyed playing these games, and they kind of had to pick up a little bit of the English along the way.
Was that brought up in the interview at all when you were over there?
No, not at all. They were very concerned. They were a little bit worried how unaware of how much French I would need when I was in Quebec City. So when I first did the interview, they're like, you know, you'll need to speak French when you get here, not for the job, but specifically, but for your social life. I was like, oh yeah, it's fine, it's fine. And then you kind of get over there and you're just like, oh yeah, I probably didn't really think that through at all. I will say, if you ever do go overseas to another country with another language, even if you don't need to speak it at your work life, but in your personal life, kind of take like a month beforehand and do an intensive language course in the country. I really wish I had done that before I'd got into Quebec City, because I ended up doing a month of 1.5 hour classes every morning before I even started work. And that accelerated me enough to start being comfortable to talk to people, you know, like just a few sentences or asking for something at the grocery store. But definitely taking some time beforehand to actually learn the language that you're going over for is a big one. As for the communities themselves, Larian kind of keeps to Larian's self a little bit, and I have heard that a little bit of the different studios, but I also think that's possibly because I haven't really been to any of the meetups since I got over there. So fortunately, I can't really talk too much about that one.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I guess what is studio life like? Do you essentially rock up to work and people are like, Nick's just going to be Nick, and you work on whatever you've got planned, or is there like, are you looking at things months ahead of time, going like, hey, this is where we're going to be, here's all the tiny little tasks that we need to do in order to get there?
I kind of have an overview of where we're going, but especially now that the studio is so big, I'm very much a very small piece in the puzzle. It's a hard one. I mean, at the end of the day, that's kind of what your producers and managers are for. They're meant to be the ones that have the overarching picture so that you don't need to worry too much about it. Something I've been trying to push back a little bit is I tend to get like a lot of, hey Nick, can you do this? And then I'll like half get it done, maybe because the tool's half complete or I'm waiting on someone else. And then I'll shift to the next task, and I never actually finish that first task. And right now, like just back at home when I get back, I've got like 5 tasks that I've all worked on, and I think one of them is finally in a somewhat finished state. So it does make life a little bit hard when you start fragmenting your work. I definitely recommend, if you can, keep maybe 1 to 3 things active at a time, but once you start getting over that sort of thing, that's when you need to start freaking out and maybe talking to someone and saying, we need to finish these, or we need to just let them drop and die because we're just not going to work on them anymore.
What's the biggest thing when you first, even Half-Brick and Larian, when you came in, did you have an expectation of what it would be like, and did it change?
Half-Brick, my original expectation was I wanted someone to mentor me. Mm-hmm. I mean, like for me, it was essentially my first job. I know I did the internship at Dreamgate, but I figured, because Dreamgate was in C# and it wasn't really my core language, and I didn't really feel like I was going to learn too much there. That was more learning how to be operated in a team. Whereas going to Half-Brick, I was like, yes, I can finally sink my teeth into some C++, and I can learn from some people that have been in the field. And really what I got there is just the practice of just programming every single day. Like actually practicing your programming on a production level was really good. And I'd say that's where Larian has shined through, is now I'm actually, rather than, because I was doing C++ to push ads, which is essentially just kind of doing the same thing day in, day out. You're doing these small content updates, you're reworking a little bit of code to get here and there. But then moving on to Larian, they're like, okay, we actually need this feature. Can you do cleaving? It's like, okay, cool, yeah, I'll see if I can get that working. I might need to talk to some of the artists or the animators or the visual effects guys.
So when you say you might ask them, is it like I'm going to go walk over to that person's desk? Or
well, okay, so it's a good thing about Quebec City is we have a mix of everyone, that usually I can work with everyone within the studio. But yeah, sometimes it very much is, you just jump onto Slack and you're like, hey, when you get up in the morning, I need an asset of this for this reason. And you try and like give them as much explanation as you possibly can, so that way they can start, because by the time they get the message, by the time you've logged in again, they would have already been working for 4 hours. So it's a bad situation to be in, like, hey, they're waiting for you to log back in so you can give them some more information. Usually front-loading information is always the way to go for a lot of these things. But yeah, sometimes I just stand up and I walk down to someone and be like, hey, can you do this for me? Sometimes it's over Slack, and sometimes I will just put in a placeholder asset that I stole from somewhere else in the engine, and I'm just like, hey, I put this in here and I've hooked it up, but you guys can change it how you want. It's out of my hands now, and that sort of thing. It very much varies. It very much varies from what you're doing.
And do you have, is there the bigger studio and the bigger teams you work for, do you find you're in meetings a lot longer, or is it generally like no, let's have a quick meeting and then...
Meetings are nightmares, and do whatever you can to avoid them, is my suggestion, because there's nothing like a quick meeting to make sure everyone's on point, or maybe you just really need to hash out how something's going to be done. Like I've had sometimes like 3-hour meetings where we're just like constantly just smashing each other for how something should be done. But then you start reaching this point where it's just like, why are we having a meeting anymore? We should just be implementing this, and then you can give me the feedback afterwards. That's something we did recently. Like I got put in task with putting some, like essentially prototyping something, and we had meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting of how we were going to be doing it, and it just got to this point. It's just like these meetings are pointless. We're just talking in circles. No one can make a decision because no one can see the final product, because at the end of the day, that's what you need. So we ended up what we're doing is we just kind of kicked off the meetings, stopped them. Me and the animator, we went off and we did some models, we did some animations, and we hooked it up together with code. And then we just brought it back to the leads, and they're like, this is what we got. And they're like, oh, I don't like this. We're like, cool, fine, we'll fix that, and we'll change it. And you bring it back to them. You're like, okay, what do you think about now? They're like, oh, I don't like this part. And then you'll take it off and you'll bring it back again. On that note, be very prepared for the fact that people cannot see a small subsection of what you're doing. If you take something and you just say, okay, we need to make this entire system, but first I'm just going to do part A, and you bring it back and you did like a little bit of part B, and you show them, you're like, hey, check out part A. It's actually like, is this what you want? And they're like, oh, part B just looks horrible on the end. And you're like, no, but I'm not talking about part B right now. I'm talking about part A. They're like, no, but like the whole thing just looks horrible. And you're like, okay, fine, whatever. So you'll have to go off sometimes and just do part B, C, and D, and then bring it back and be like, all right, what do you think? They're like, okay, that's cool. Yeah, and I really like how you've done this in part A, or this part in part A just doesn't quite fit. Like the amount of times I've had people who used to be in the exact same position as me that have been like, who've been in the trenches, as you might say, essentially. They've worked on a single feature, they just want to show off this single feature, and then you show it to someone and they just completely focus on the thing you did not want them to focus on because you hadn't worked on it yet, essentially.
Does that come down to being clear about what the objective of a specific task is, or is it people will always still...
Some people just cannot take something, the small part, and imagine the rest. Some people are very much, what you see is what you get, and because I do not see the whole thing, I can't, I think it's not working. Even though for you, you're like, no, part A is working, part B and C is just incomplete. Some people you might have to, you will probably learn as you get there, when you're going to present to something to some of these people that you need to do A, B, and C. You can't just do A, because some people just can't see past that, unfortunately.
Having been in the industry for a little while now, is there anything that you see like common mistakes juniors might be making? This could apply for art, programming, design.
Common mistakes juniors make is they always feel like they're bugging someone. They don't want to ask too many questions because there's always that feedback in your part of your mind that's just like, I probably shouldn't be here, or I'm underqualified for this job. Every junior is a junior. We expect to mentor you when you come into the industry. There's no junior in there that will pick it up like that. The more questions you ask, the better, especially clarification questions. Because there's nothing worse than me giving you a task and you going off and doing the complete opposite of that and then coming back 3 weeks later and be like, cool, it's done. And you're like, this is not what I asked for in any fashion. A trick that I've kind of developed is I'll have a discussion with someone, I'll get them to say what they want, then I repeat back exactly what they said to them, but in my own words. And the amount of times people will disagree with what I just said back to them is astounding. And it has helped clear so many hurdles, because someone will be like, hey, I want you to do like a climbing mechanic. And you're like, cool. So I'll repeat that one. So you want me to implement like a ladder system or something? Like you want me, like a character to be able to climb up this wall with a ladder or something? No, I don't want a ladder. I want them to, like climb up on the thing. It's like, okay, cool. But had you thought about, maybe the fact that we don't have any animations for that? They're like, oh yeah, we probably need custom animation for that, and we don't really have the budget for the animation, so they might think about it a little bit more. Having that back and forth conversation, like you'll save yourself so much time in the long run. And also don't be afraid to constantly be like searching feedback. Sometimes it might not be searching feedback from your lead, because your leads will always be busy in meetings or to discussions or trying to work out what the current plan is. But even just grabbing other people from around the office and be like, hey, what do you think? And be like, that looks weird and wrong. And you're like, oh, why does it feel wrong? Why does it look weird? And then you kind of get little bits here and there. Sometimes it might be like I would have a discussion with an artist and be like, how do you use this tool? Because I'm going to be implementing a new feature and I want to make sure that you can still use it correctly and that my thing doesn't like interrupt with the normal workflow and those sorts of things.
Any questions out there for Nick? Yeah.
You mentioned previously that Larian was kind of using a waterfall approach, but they were going to be changing that. Do you know?
Would you be able to repeat the question?
Oh yeah, I will repeat the question. So the question was, at Larian I was saying that we kind of have a very much a waterfall approach at the moment and that we might be changing. I can't say what it is we might be changing to. I mean, every studio I've ever been, they always love talking about Scrum and Agile and Kanban boards and that sort of thing. At the end of the day, it's kind of like, it's what works for the company. You can't say there is a hard set thing. It's great to be aware of Agile. It's great to be aware of Scrum and Kanban and all these different kind of methodologies for how you should work. I know quite a few people are just huge fans of I think it's the Pomodoro approach, where you work for, I think it's an hour and then you take a 20-minute break or something like that. It's in that sort of regime, essentially. At the end of the day, it comes down to what works for you, and I call it a waterfall approach, usually because I'm generally one of the people at the end, and I'm not really having an overarching view of what's going on. I very much get, hey Nick, this is what you're working on next. Hey Nick, this is what you're working on next. And in the current state, I might get some deadlines, but right now I don't really get many deadlines, so it very much feels waterfall for me, because it's done when it's done, and then I move on to the next task, or until someone tells me to switch on to something else that's higher priority, or that sort of thing.
Yeah, Tony?
So how are the development teams structured? Do you have a physics team, an AI team, an investment team, an engine team,
Yeah. So the question was, how are the teams structured, like whether we have a physics team, if we have like a rendering team and all that sort of thing. So we're splitting towards that a little bit. We definitely have the gameplay team. Like that consists of me, and we've got a gameplay lead. And I think we've got 3 or 4 other gameplay programmers. We've got a couple interns in Ghent at the moment, which is pretty cool, which is always nice to have some interns on, because they're kind of the guys that you're just like, can you just do this real quick for me? And you pretend you're mentoring them when you just complain about the work that they did. We definitely have the guys that are definitely more on the rendering side. We definitely have the guys that are more on the engine side of things. But definitely at Larian, there still very much is sometimes you just need someone to grab something, or you just need a programmer to help you, and sometimes it's just you grab whichever programmer is available. Sometimes it just might be completely the wrong person. They will very quickly let you know that they can't help you with this sort of thing. But there are plenty of times, like, for example, we have a programmer whose entire job is making it so that it's very easy to make new builds of the game, and they automate that process for us, and they make it very easy. So like, if someone checks in some code that breaks the game, then we get some alert messages to say, hey, one of these 5 people probably broke the game with something that they put in recently, and those sorts of things. So we definitely have like specific people who can do this, but there have been plenty of situations as me as a gameplay programmer, I've jumped into the engine side of things, and maybe I'm doing some debugging, or maybe there's a feature missing that I need, and I might ask someone just like, hey dude, like this is missing. They're like, yeah, you can make a Jira for it and I'll get to it. It's like, no, I need it now. I'm gonna do it, and I'll just send you the review and you can tell me if I did something wrong. Plenty of situations like that, which personally I kind of like, being able to the fact that if I really need to, I can jump into these different systems and no one's gonna bite my head off about it. Because definitely you get more of an idea of what you're working on in that sort of fashion. But we do kind of have the departments. I mean, we've got the visual effects department, we've got our animators, we've got our character artists, we've got our environment artists, we've got our environment, like our level designers, and well, environmental artists is technically the correct term there. And we've got all the different ones, all the different departments of a big studio you'd have. It's just, we've probably got like 2 or 3 people in each of them rather than hundreds, is what you'd expect. Oh, that's, yeah. So the question being like, do we have like the engine split off into different libraries? 100%. We've got a bunch of different libraries that all do different things. There is a bunch of legacy where some things are just so integrated into the game. To give you an example, we have a ginormous character class, and it is a nightmare to work with on the gameplay side of things. So not that we could make a lib out of this specifically, but it's an example of sometimes like we've had code that's been in the game for so long that you're not going to decouple it straight away, and it could take years and years before it finally is broken into its own little thing. But it is great because anything new is always in its own library. And so an example, we use Bullet we were using Bullet for DOS 2. And then when we moved to working on the console editions, we needed to change over to PhysX because it's cheaper, it's quicker, it does things a lot better than what Bullet did for us at the time. And so literally all we did was we had the old Bullet plugin and we had some wrapper code around it, and we just took out the Bullet part and we plugged in the PhysX part, and then everything just kept working.
People don't understand what is physics.
Yeah, physics engines for the actual game. So essentially all the mathematics behind when this object collides with this object, what should happen with that. Sometimes you might want things to bounce off. Sometimes you just need an alert that they've collided. Sometimes you just need to know the distance between two central points and all those sorts of things. Well, very, very complicated mathematics that needs to run incredibly efficiently. And yeah, so we switched one because PhysX is it technically is one of the leaders when it comes to physics in this sort of fashion. Yeah, they just went open source too, which is insane. Wow. Pretty cool.
Any other questions? Yep.
If someone were to put something in that broke the build or anything like that,
Mm-hmm.
is it like a seriously dangerous thing for them, or is it just like a small?
No. I mean, yeah, so the question, like, if someone breaks the build, if someone puts in something that broke something, like, is it essentially, are they in trouble for it, is kind of what you're getting at? Yeah? It happens all the time. It's not stuff we fret about. We just try and make sure there are things in place to catch it before other people catch it. Because the last thing you want to do is like, I just put something in that broke something, and now the entire office can't work anymore. That's when we'd freak out about it. And then if you're a coder specifically, we might be having some conversation, be like, hey dude, why did you put this in? You should have seen that this would cause some problems. But there are so many situations just like, I forgot a file. And because I forgot a file, things don't compile, and then everyone else is going to complain to me about it. But in those situations, we usually have something that will pick it up, let you know about it, and you can just do it real quickly. A lot of the times, because you've got people in the same office as you just get a tap on your shoulder like, hey dude, I saw you last committed and this thing isn't building, and it's a file that seems somewhat related to you, so they'll let you know about it. We're usually very quick on the turnaround. What's the dangerous part is doing the Friday night check-in and then going, and you didn't really test any of your stuff. That's stuff we try and avoid. A lot of studios have massive problems on this. People love to push builds on weekends, and it's the worst time to push a build because if something goes wrong, everyone needs to come back in on the weekend and fix it. Best day of the week is a Wednesday to push stuff, because you've got Monday, Tuesday to get things in order, you push it on Wednesday, and then you've got Thursday, Friday to fix it up if anything goes wrong, which always goes wrong. There's always stuff that goes wrong.
Is there any way to get a rough idea of percentage-wise, like how big's the programming team versus like maybe the narrative or the art teams?
So
like at a glance,
in Quebec City, we've got about 30, 40 people. 5 of us are programmers. I'm the one gameplay programmer. Okay, so we have the studio lead, studio head, who used to be a gameplay programmer but doesn't really do that much programming anymore, but I think he's actually had to do programming since I went on vacation because we don't have another gameplay programmer in Quebec City right now. We are looking for one. So we've got him, but he doesn't do much programming, so that's 1 out of 5. There's me, 2 out of 5. We've got 2 engine programmers, one who's definitely more on the graphics side, one he's graphics and something else, and then we've got the last programmer who's more of a tools programmer herself. So we've got like this nice mix between us. But 2 of them are actually about to go back to Belgium at probably halfway through next year, I think they're leaving. So we desperately need to get some more progress on, otherwise we're going to be left with essentially 2 programmers and the studio lead who doesn't really do programming anymore.
Speaking of which, and they're probably not junior positions, but can someone in Canberra, Melbourne, wherever, apply for a job over there, or is it best to be
So
there?
I could talk specifically for Larian, but probably what you'll find across the industry is if you're a junior, they will not be offering you a job if you apply overseas, just for the simple fact that you don't have a visa. That's really what it comes down to. They don't want to take the risk on someone that they would have to spend $1,000 on just to get a visa for. Then they might need to be spending money on flying you over there with relocation and that sort of thing. Depends on the company, like I'll get to that in a sec. So a lot of the time you will not find you're going to get replies as a junior programmer, or sorry, junior in general, for these sorts of studios. But what is advantageous, which is what I did, is I just went and got myself a visa myself and said, I'm already coming, how about now? And they're like, oh, you're already coming, which means we don't have to do your visa, which means we don't have to do your relocation bonus, which means if things go wrong for any reason, you probably already have an open visa, which means you can get work somewhere else if you need to. And it's a working holidays, which technically is the assumption that you're going to go home anyway. So they're much more likely to take a risk on you. Well, a risk. In fact, they're probably more likely to treat you essentially like they would any other local. There is a side that you need to be aware of, is that anytime a studio hires someone internationally, they need to explain it to the government. And especially when your studio has already got like maybe 20 people that are international hires, and now you want to hire someone else that's another international hire, it's really sometimes hard for a studio to convince them. In fact, I remember having a chat with the guys that hired me, and they were very much ready to not hire me just for the fact that I wasn't a local, because they needed more locals in the office. So I very much lucked out on that sort of thing. But having your visa up front, which is super easy to get, I think it's like $300 to get. It takes a couple months to apply for. The catch is that you just need to show that you have $5,000 that you can support yourself on. But that does include credit cards. So if you have like 5,000 credit card limit and that sort of thing, and you haven't spent anything on it yet. So essentially what you need is just like have like $2,000 in savings or something like that, or maybe that sort of thing, and a credit card, and you'll probably be much accepted for. So for Canada, it's 30 is the last year that you can apply for it. And that's for a 2-year open visa. You can work anywhere in Canada for that sort of situation. I think I think Europe has 31, or maybe it's Britain that I'm thinking of, because since we had Brexit, or potential Brexit. Definitely do some research into the other countries, because I didn't even look into them. The United States is definitely one of the hardest places to get a visa for. They're just super strict about that sort of thing, but looking around Europe and in Canada is definitely one of your best bets. And in speaking of that, actually, a lot of Asian companies, because they're really picking up now, you'd be very surprised at how easy you'd probably be able to get a visa for Asia, and how easy it is to find a company that would be willing to take you if you're just looking for experience. And that
so
sort of thing.
places like Quebec, they were able to justify you because there was so many studios just snapping up all local.
Yeah, so that's the thing. So in Quebec City itself, we have Ubisoft, we have Gearbox, we have Beanox, we have a bunch of like mobile studios, and they essentially snap up all the local talent. Larian itself is actually having a real hard time finding intermediate level roles, essentially. Juniors, generally it's pretty okay to find juniors. There's always a lot of juniors out there, but sometimes finding the right junior for your position or for your role can be quite trying. And the interview processes are quite long as well, because sometimes you're interviewing like 30 odd people, and each interview, like you're staging them at 3 hours per person, and then you're trying to like do your own work during the day as well. So if you ever feel like that the interview processes are really slow, this is generally why. It's
so
because
you've also been on the other side of the hiring process for Larian?
I haven't been the person hiring, but I sit right next to the studio head and the other programmer who does sit in all the programmers and all the interviews. So we're all pretty close there. So I hear about it all the time, and I quiz them all the time, because I used to get super pissed off when I was sending out resumes and not getting replies.
Any other questions? Oh, sorry, yeah.
On that topic, if somebody couldn't get a job in a games industry, but they got a job, so I've got one of my graduates last year who's got a job working in a local company programming C++.
Yeah.
It's not on games per se, but it's doing image processing software, so filtering
Yeah.
and stuff. Would you still count him as a junior? Would you count him as a...
Yeah, so question was like, if someone wasn't working in games and they were doing C++, for example, which is a language that we work with at Larian. In fact, I'll come back to that in a second. yes, but just the fact that you're working outside of games isn't actually that big of a deal, because usually what we're looking for is just someone that understands C++ and has a passion for games. Because as long as you've got kind of two of those, especially if you're in a junior position, we can teach you a lot, or you'll just learn from doing, essentially. Obviously, if you've done some, like, specifically if you're going for a gameplay programmer role, you should be brushing up on your gameplay programmer skills. So making things that are a little bit fun or usable, or work with artists and designers and that sort of thing. If you're applying for an engine position, then you really need to have a really good core concept of the language itself, of different data structures, of different sorting methods, for example. Like, for example, at Larian Studios, we wrote all our own data structures. We wrote all our own containers. We wrote all our own sorting algorithms. Usually they're written from a pre-existing knowledge base, like, because a lot of the industry uses the same sort of stuff, but it's always tweaked in a little way that suits the suits the programmer themselves, but suits the engine themselves. But there's very rarely you'd have a negative side of things if you're working outside of the industry. I mean, to give you an example, we had a engine programmer who moved over from Belgium to Quebec to help get the studio up and running, and he was coming over with his partner at the time. And she never worked in games, but she did work in C# quite a bit, which means she actually used tools, did a lot of tools programming. So even though she had absolutely no experience in video games, we took her in because it was super, super convenient to just be able to say, oh, the partner's here as well. Okay, we also have a job for you as well. And we didn't need to like go through all the hoops and stuff like that. So that was super convenient for us. And she's been, one of the most recent ones was like, she's been doing some tools for I think it was like a wall editor, essentially. And she technically has no experience in video games, but it doesn't really actually hold up that much. Because at the end of the day, you're kind of just crunching numbers and making usable tools, at least from her side of things.
I think on that bombshell that walls have been confirmed for the next game, we'll probably wrap it up there. But please join me in thanking Nick for coming. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
What kind of content did you have in your portfolio in both preparing for a...
Pretty much what you're seeing here, actually. Does this have the internet? I know what you're getting at, don't worry. So this is something I whipped up. This is Squarespace, I think, is the website I put together. It cost me like, I want to say like $170 a year or something like that. I found this super useful. In fact, you probably can't find it anymore. I used to have like an old website. It was just like completely free, and I literally just spammed images on it. But I can give you an idea of what my resume essentially looked like. So I had, so this is literally what consisted of my very first portfolio. It was just a bunch of screenshots from Light in the Dark that I did at my internship. And so you can kind of go through here. I had a brief example down the bottom. If we go up to hobby, there was a bunch of stuff from this I also included in my portfolio. So for example, Don't Touch My Stick, Box Bots, Human Tetris, made it with this guy over here. Some shader stuff that I just like to work on. This stuff is like from my second year of programming. I've barely touched it since then, really. Osiris Engine, so that was like me and a friend Luke. We had to go at making our own Voxel Engine. And I mean, literally all it was just like being able to generate a terrain, but it was a lot of fun. We learned an absolute heap out of it. Something else was like procedurally generated stairs. I mean, it's nothing fancy or anything like that. It was like super, 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 super basic. This one I was a little bit more proud of, is being able to dynamically slice a mesh up. So in this case, it was a quad that you could piece back together. But like, I had just like, essentially just took a lot of the small projects that I did over the years, put them together in my portfolio, and I just had essentially something that they could just click on and just get a bunch of different images. My resume is what I probably spent the most of my time on. I love sharing resumes because I feel like everyone should learn from them. I've updated my, here we go, cool. So what I always love doing is a cover letter. And so here you can actually see ngzaharias.carbonmade.com. It's completely inactive now, but that used to be the website I used to use back in the day. I've got my GitHub link which they could see that I had some personal projects up there. Basically, any personal project I did, I made sure it was on GitHub so that people could see it. I had a LinkedIn profile. This is probably updated since then. Oh God, it won't even let you see it, will it? Because I'm...
I think if you go by...
That's all good. There are, make sure that your LinkedIn, like open it, copy your link, put it into a incognito tab, try it with all your links, because the amount of times that you'll click on like your link and then it like takes you there because you're already logged in is ridiculous. But LinkedIn, there are technical links that you're meant to be able to supply that anyone can just view. So always double check your links is always a big one. But you can see there, it's just like a brief cover letter, I talk a little bit about myself, why I would be excited to working with this company. I've also got like, you know, sometimes I might just put the cover letter in the email itself, but the actual resume itself, try and keep it to 2 pages and under. You'll start getting bigger pages, but that's literally because your game development experience will start hashing out. Like literally right there, game development experience, group project, game jams, that's it. Like there's not much more to talk because I hadn't even done my internship by this point. Actually no, maybe I had, there we go. Dreamgate Studios up the top, Academy of Interactive Entertaining, tutoring, I kind of fuzz that in. Something I do see that a lot of people make the mistake of is when you get to the technical skills. Don't chuck in everything under the sun that you think you've ever possibly covered in your time of study. Nobody cares. And when they ask you about it and you go, I spent like a week on it, that looks actually very, very bad on you. So for the programmers here, I would say C++ should be up there. C# maybe, depends on how much time you spent doing some work in Unity. But you definitely don't consider yourself like a C# programmer just because you've spent some time in Unity. C# is a lot deeper than you might expect. It looks simple on the top, but it's got its own quirks, it's got its own depth, just like C++ does. And if you look at C++ and go, wow, it's a very complicated language and I don't know anything about it, just take that and apply it to C# and you're the same. But yeah, so this was a mistake I did when I first started. It's like, yeah, I know C++, I know GLSL, I know C#, Python, Java, JavaScript, Lua, and JSON. I know all these languages. It's not true. I just had a little bit of experience with some of them. It's totally acceptable if you say core language, C++, some experience, these other ones. You know, like that's totally fine, but try not to pass off yourself as knowing more than you actually do, because they will catch you out. Because they will ask you questions about it, because sometimes they might be, oh, hey, yeah, we've got a C# developer. That's great. We really need one in-house. Let's see what he knows so we can see if he fits into our situation. Sorry, I'm kind of talking from the perspective of me here. Technologies, Visual Studio, probably could have left it at that. A little bit of experience with Unity and UE4. Git and Perforce. I think everyone still uses Perforce here? Possibly? No? Not using Perforce? First user, okay. So they're totally acceptable, like especially if you spent a year like actively working in these environments, totally fine to put those up.
What do you use version control when you're on there?
At the moment we're using Perforce. We're actually having nightmares with them, mostly because some of the decisions that we made with it and some Perforce bugs.
How do you get around sharing repositories across different countries, different continents?
Well, that's the thing. We've got every repo's got its own, like every studio has its own local repo, so that way you get immediate push and pull. And then we just have, anytime there's a push or a pull to a central one is essentially what happens. So we have our local server is constantly updating with the regional one, essentially, is what's there. Brief education in there, and then of course the same links as before. Referees, I don't think I've ever had someone contact one of my referees. Having said that, I've had Jacob, he's a guy that he graduated with me. He put me as a referee. He asked me beforehand, and he was just like, hey, is it cool if I put you as a referee? I was like, totally fine. I got an email. I just wrote a couple sentences about him. It was pretty cash. I mean,
was this recently when he was heading?
Yeah, this was when he went to Pickpock. Yeah, so I had a friend, he used to work at Halfbrick. I actually got him the job at Halfbrick, and then Halfbrick did a boatload of redundancies. I think they got rid of 2/3 of their company, and then he moved over to Pickpock. So once you're in the industry, just link your friends as references if you really want to. I usually put this. I've never ever had anyone ask me for a reference. References it's really just like when they need it, they'll probably ask for it, but always make sure that the person you're referencing knows that you've referenced them, because it's always a little bit weird to be like, hey, do you know such and such? You're like, yeah, I do. Why are you contacting me? This is a little bit weird. I mean, most people in the industry, everyone's pretty nice, so they'd probably write a good thing about you anyway, but it's
and I guess
courteous.
If you plan to use a teacher for a reference, especially starting out, make sure that you've been handing your assessments in on time, and that you're not just using them as a reference because you know them. They'll be the first to say that you haven't handed everything in on time and stuff like that. So yeah, make sure that you're...
Yeah, for everyone here, I'd say put teachers, because that's the best reference you're going to have at this stage. Once you're out into the industry, just put people you used to work with or your managers or stuff like that. It usually goes pretty far. But I guess in answer to your question, my portfolio wasn't incredible. I didn't have like this amazing, outstanding portfolio or anything like that. But I did have projects I had worked on in my personal time or at university. Like everything I showed you before was personal projects, and there are only a couple of things that actually came from my university degree. Because usually your university degree or your assignments that you've been doing, right? It's a very structured approach, and it's to make sure that you're learning and you're understanding your content. And that's great, and it's perfect for your learning, but sometimes it's just, you want to have something a little bit extra on top of that. If you took your personal project, your university project, and you extended on it, that's totally acceptable. Submit that stuff, and because it's going to stand out against everyone else's stuff. But I wouldn't expect you to be able to just take your university stuff and submit that, and that would be perfect. I mean, there are plenty of places you probably could get a job. I'm just saying though that if you really want to make sure you're going to get a job, put your personal projects in. Get some personal projects out there. They make all the world, and it also helps diversify you as well, speaking for me, as a programmer, but also as an artist or as a designer, as a level designer. I mean, if you're like a general game design thing, like every scripter and game designer that we have in the company all play D&D. And in fact, they've even run their own campaigns, which is usually something that we ask them about. Like, have you run your own D&D campaigns? Have you made up your own quests? You know, have you actually, is it just an idea in your head, or have you put it down on pencil? And then have you run other people through it and then discovered where all your flaws were, or you didn't think of something and what had to change? Like, usually it's not just, does this person know the content, or has this person applied the content in a real life situation? That's why personal projects become a really big thing.
And does that go, are you able to say that goes the same for art and things like that as well? Or?
Yeah, art's always a little hard one. The most I tend to have to do with the artists tends to be the animators specifically. And I do know that some of the animators love to do just their own personal animation projects. But unfortunately, I just can't talk too much about their side of things. But I'd find it very hard to not feel that it doesn't carry over into these other disciplines as well. Every time I talk to someone, they're always looking for that little bit extra. They're always looking for someone that's actually going to be interested in the job that they're applying for. That's another one. Be very careful about applying for a job and then going into an interviewing and not knowing about the company you're applying for. I have done that before, and it looks really bad, and you feel a bit like an ass afterwards for it. I think one time I rattled off that HTML was a programming language just in my nervousness, because they asked me a question I wasn't expecting. So that was a little bit awkward.
Cool.
Yeah. Any other questions?
What you were talking about, like ages that they'll take you in when you move to another country.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm 35.
Yep.
Which means I'm like over the age.
Yep.
If I have experience, like get experience here in Australia, and I'm trying to go overseas, can the company themselves get
100%, and that's what I was saying before. It's generally if you're looking for junior positions, that's when things become a little bit hard trying to get a job overseas, because a lot of companies have a really hard time applying, taking the chance on a junior, unless you're someone that you've really shown yourself as to be an amazing junior, which is basically you're entering the level of an intermediate developer. Without that, it can be very hard to get a job overseas. But once you start breaking the junior barrier, and that can just be from doing a lot of contracting work. It doesn't mean you have to get a job at a studio. There's nothing wrong with, for example, doing like the incubator program. Jack Noble, he did the incubator program. I think he worked on, was it Kiru for 3 years, maybe more?
Yeah, about that.
About that. He did that along with contracting, and he just worked in part-time stuff to keep himself afloat. But he worked on that for quite a while, and then I wouldn't say he's a junior anymore, and he's got a company that's taking him on remotely, which has actually suited him perfectly. He didn't actually need to move overseas for that. But there are a lot of options out there. You do have to really search for them when you're starting out. But once you do break that junior barrier, that's when you can start applying for companies overseas and be like, hey, look, I've got this very explicit experience that I think would be a perfect match for your studio. What do you reckon? And they were like, hey, this person is an intermediate. Let's give them an interview. Let's see if we like him. And then, like, the fact that they're giving you an interview means they're considering the fact that they would be happy to fly you over. Maybe they might not be able to cover the costs of flights and that sort of thing, but they would definitely be able to cover the costs of getting you a visa and that sort of thing. Another mistake I see a lot of people make is just applying for the big studios. They only think that big studios are going to take them, like Ubisoft, EA, all those ones. Totally not true. There are so many studios out there that you can apply for. Something I did when I went to Canada, I went through, I think I found like an interactive map with like a reasonably update version of studios overseas, and I went through every single city and I wrote down I looked at every single job posting that there was, and I sent an email off to these people that had something that I felt was somewhat relevant to me, which I think was even a mistake. You can just email these companies and be like, hey, I'm looking for a job. I want to come over. I'm super happy to relocate. It's just me. Like, these are my skills and that sort of thing. Sometimes you won't hear a response immediately. Sometimes you might hear it 6 months or a year later, but sometimes that's totally fine because who knows where you're going to be in a year. Maybe you didn't find anything, and then suddenly a year later you're like, hey, this company just reached out to me that I applied for like a year ago, but now they finally actually have a position for me available and they seem interested. So you'd be always surprised about some of the things that can come back to you down the line.
And
but
unless I'm remembering wrong, at the time you even were looking into like visual effects studios because they also have
yeah,
like
100%.
positions and stuff like that at the time.
Just because it's not directly in your field doesn't mean you can't apply for it. Give it a go, because worst case scenario, they don't reply, right? And then you're no worse off than you were before. There's nothing anyone can do that'll take you down a notch just because you applied to their company or anything like that.
Cool.
Yeah. Small studios, look for small studios. They're always looking for people. Keep your eyes around, and once you start doing more networking, then you start having friends in the industry. They start recommending you jobs or recommending you to other people. In fact, the contracting job I got at the Voxel Agents was directly because someone I used to work with at Halfbrick was networking with someone at GCAP, and they're the owners of the Voxel Agents, and they happened to be looking for a programmer at the time. And so that just fell right into my lap because I just happened to be in the right position at the right time. I think actually there's an old adage which is like, no one is lucky, you make your own luck. And by making your luck, that means you've gone out and you've made all these connections and networks. Because things don't fall into your lap. It's because I knew these people, I'd worked with them, I'd told people I was looking for work. People knew that I had finished up at Halfbrick and I might be going overseas, and so I was looking for contracting work at the time. So just like putting that stuff out there eventually will find its way back to you.
Yeah, and last question, I guess, before we wrap up, and it's not so much a question, it's just an observation. Even when I think you was just started at Halfbrick, or you'd been there a little while, you still volunteered at things like GCAP as a...
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. So when I was I think I did one GCAP when I was at AIE, or at least towards the end of AIE, and I think I did one GCAP when I was at Halfbrick, and I just kind of went down with all my Halfbrick friends. But the GCAP after that, I actually went and volunteered for it. And that got me more networks than the other times I'd done it, actually. Maybe it was because I was a little bit further on in my career, possibly, but also being one of the volunteers, you actually get to meet a lot of people behind the scenes, and you kind of chat with them and you help them out and that sort of thing. And not to mention that, you meet a lot of the organizers behind GCAP. Like Tony Reed, I think Liam Essler was doing a bunch of stuff back then. He's not now, but you'd be amazed how many of the people that run these things, how many connections they have is absolutely monumental. I mean, for example, there's like Yug. He used to run PAX, and he used to be at a lot of the GCAPs and those sorts of things because that's where all the developers are. He now runs all the PAXs around all over the world. In fact, my CEO knows him You know, like you get some really strange connections there. So you really want to try and meet and be friendly to as many people as you possibly can.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for spending a bunch of your time while you're here on holidays, coming in and chatting with everyone.
Happy to.
Join me in thanking Nick, everyone.
Hey, look, it's that game I worked on.
Yeah, that game's good. You should play it.
Totally.